Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to February Sustainability Forum. The COVID honeymoon is over. My name is Liz Moore, and I'm one of the student engagement coordinators at the Office of Sustainability, along with Delaney Carr, and we'll be guiding you through today's event. Sweet. So here's the agenda for today, and it will start with an introduction to the Office of Sustainability, followed by Dr. Lefcort from the biology department, who will share some information on the intersection of COVID and climate change. And then Brady O'Gara from Mission and Ministry will be leading a reflection, and we'll have a discussion in breakout groups before closing today's event. This is just kind of the guide. Yeah, so at the Office of Sustainability, we offer a lot of things for students and community members. Basically, we're a place for assistance for students that have questions or passions about sustainability, as we want to support you in finding internships, starting projects, or whatever you're looking for in the realm of sustainability. We are just a place where we're here to help you guys, community members and students alike.
Yeah, so now that you guys know a little bit about what the office is about, like Liz said, this is an event we put on roughly every month. And so kind of segueing into the forum, we decided to choose a topic that's really relevant to today, being in the COVID pandemic. And so, a year ago, roughly actually a year ago from today, there were stay-at-home orders, quarantine, lockdowns, etc., put in place. And then as a result, there was a lot of media coverage and kind of exposure on the decrease in global emissions. And so we kind of wanted to bring back that topic and kind of talk more about climate change and why it's still important to address climate change, even in a pandemic. And so we invited one of our own, Gonzaga's behavioral ecologist in the biology department, Dr. Hugh Lefcourt. He has also reviewed research on climate change with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Maybe most people know it as IPCC. So he knows a lot about this topic. Hi, Dr. Lefcourt, how are you? Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to switch share screens, I think, because so I'll stop sharing my screen. If you'd like to share yours for the presentation.
Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Lefcort in biology, and I do research on, so one of the things, so as humans put out CO2, one of the effects is climate change. The other effects of that CO2 is it goes into water. So if you think about like carbon dioxide and soda pop, it makes it acidic, that makes it tangy. The same thing happens in the oceans and it happens in fresh water. So I'm a behavioral ecologist and I look at how the acidity changes behavior of like prey animals, particularly how it makes them more susceptible to their predators. So it's kind of this other part of the whole CO2 question. You hear a lot about climate and that it's definitely a major issue. But remember, majority of creatures are still in the ocean. They're not on land. And the ocean's affected by temperature, but it also, acidity is a major issue and problem. So that's where I'm coming from. Let me share my screen and start talking about COVID and climate change. Okay, so you guys are seeing my screen? Good. So the thing about when we're talking about climate change, you got to realize there's two parts to it. So there's the science of climate change and there's the politics of climate change. And they're both equally valid. There's just two different parts. And so as a scientist, I'm only going to talk about the science. I'm not going to talk about, Greta or Bill McKibben. Those people have their roles, but things that they say may be a little more exaggerated just because that's how politics is done. I don't fault them, but scientists are usually pretty careful in what we say. So the data I'm gonna present you, the last AR5, the last IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out a couple of years ago. Another one's coming out next year. And so I'll talk about data that's in the last report and other papers that have been published since then. Because all the IPCC does is compile all the papers that are out. They don't actually do research. They're the people that do research, and then they look at their papers and other people's papers. Then people like me review what they put together. So I'm going to make a couple of points. One, I want to make an emphasis about climate change is not the biggest environmental problem we have right now. A bigger environmental problem, climate change may become bigger in the future, but right now the biggest problem is habitat loss. And if you guys are interested in activism, habitat loss is so much more doable. You as an individual can do almost nothing on climate change. It's such a big problem, and 2/3 of it is now switched to the non-Western world. So we're talking largely about Asia, Africa, whereas habitat loss, shopping centers going in, Gonzaga building new engineering buildings, that stuff you have real influence on. You could prevent a building going in. That geese habitat near the pond, that's in your hands. If enough students protested that, it wouldn't have happened. Whereas, emissions in China, you have very little effect. So habitat loss is a bigger problem currently, and it's much more doable. So I'm not downplaying climate change. I'm trying to make the point that if after 30 years we haven't accomplished much in reducing CO2 and it just keeps going up, why are we still, if we can only do one issue, and politically usually you can only do one issue, maybe habitat loss should be that issue. But then I want to talk about, the climate is definitely warming, the seas are rising, seas are acidifying with CO2 and methane production. Methane doesn't affect acidification, but it definitely affects temperature. There were a temporary drop with COVID, so I'm not actually going to talk that much about COVID. But the thing is, if you think about, most of us haven't changed our lifestyle. So it's kind of like when you go hiking. You go hiking and you have very little carbon footprint, but then you come home after 2 days and the first thing you do is you run the shower, turn on the espresso machine, run the dishwasher, run the clothes dryer, clothes washer. You really just delay your carbon footprint when you go hiking for 2 days. And that's kind of what we did with COVID. We did initially cut back, but then we bounced right back. And it was because most of us didn't really change our lives. There was some, temporary slowdowns where we stopped driving, but within a couple of months, we kind of bounced back. So it's really, that was the point I'm trying to make with habitat loss, is it's much easier to address because energy use is just really hard to get people to use less. Then I want to talk about the fact that among countries, there are always winners and losers. The key thing to understand about climate change is the word change. And anytime there's change, even if a majority is negative, there'll be some winners who are going to be less interested in effects. So if you live in Siberia or Canada, most of the effects are probably positive. There are negative effects. If you live in Arizona, it's definitely a disaster. Also, I want to talk about organisms. So there's two things that students seem to worry about climate change. One, they worry about how it's going to affect people, but there are other groups of students that affects them less, and they worry about how it's affecting organisms. So I want to talk about the last time, 55 million years ago, we had massive climate change, and make the point that organisms have effects in the short term, but in the long term, climate change is probably good for them. Humans are probably going to have more problems with climate change. But if your main concern is habitat, this definitely isn't the end of organisms. A warmer, wetter world tends to be more diverse and have more biomass. And then I also want to make the point that it's a problem and a solution is now not in Western countries. So it's not America and Europe and Singapore, the richer countries. It's now a poor country issue, and it's really hard to change those countries. So this is from the last IPCC. So let me just read this. It's trying to make the point about how important is climate change. For most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to the impact of other drivers. Changes in population, age, income, technology, relative prices, lifestyle, regulation, governance, and many other aspects of socioeconomic development will have an impact on the supply and demand of economic goods and services that is large relative to the impact of climate change. So what they're saying is that climate change potentially could be bigger, but definitely in the near term and in the medium term, it's not the major effect on your life. And the evidence of this, and this is kind of prescient what they wrote, but the evidence of it is this. If you think back 10 years from now about, 2020, 2021, what was the major event that occurred in your life? It's not going to be that sea levels went up 1/10 of an inch. That's not what you're going to remember in 10 years. That's not what you're going to tell your grandkids. You're going to tell your grandkids, yeah, we had this Zoom thing and people wore masks and that was just totally normal. And we didn't go out and all these people died. So this was Sunday that I pulled these numbers. I mean, 2.5 million people. That's a major effect. So it's not that climate change isn't real, it's definitely real. And it's not that it's not having effects, and it potentially could have large effects, but it's just not the biggest. That doesn't say anything negative about climate change. It just says there are other things that really affect your lives. I mean, you guys have lost a whole year of your life, schooling wise. That's something to think about. The other thing is habitat loss. So this was a study that came out in 2019. Insects are a really good indice of organisms, since there's a lot of insects, and if insects are having trouble, we can look at what they're having trouble with. And what this paper was saying is that biodiversity of insects is threatened worldwide, and they looked at a whole series of studies to find out what are the major reasons that insects have had trouble. And they list them in importance, and habitat loss and conversion to intensive agriculture and urbanism. So, parking lots, that's the main cause of global insect declines. Pollution, pesticides and fertilizers, biological factors like COVID, pathogens, what you and I are experiencing now. Fourth is climate change. So it's not that climate change isn't a big issue, it's just that it's not the biggest. So the point I'm trying to make in this talk is not only is it not the biggest, but it's one of the hardest to change. So if you want to make a difference in the world, there are things right here you can make a difference on, the first three. And they're bigger problems. And so, that's where I would put my effort into. Climate change is pretty straightforward. A lot of you guys just understand that, the Earth is in balance of how much energy comes in, how much energy goes out. With a CO2 cloud and methane cloud around the Earth, it's kind of like your car on a hot summer day. Sunlight comes in, but the heat doesn't get out. So that's a problem. We're putting too much of these gases out, and the Earth each day keeps a little bit of extra heat as surplus. And we know this is causing changes. If you look at the change in permafrost, this red area in permafrost is the expansion, where we've lost permafrost. So it's where ground is permanently frozen. It's no longer permanently frozen in these red regions. And if we look at just global mean temperatures, it's especially a problem in the poles, where temperatures have gone up the most between 1981 and 2010. So the world's definitely getting hotter. It's getting hotter because of what we're releasing. Sea levels are going up. If we look from 1880 to 2000, change in sea levels in centimeters. Sea levels are definitely going up. There are major effects of climate change. And ocean acidification. This graph's a little more confusing, but we've got time from 1940 to 2010. And in red here, we're seeing the rise of CO2 in Hawaii. So CO2 keeps going up. And then in blue here, we're seeing pH going down. So it's getting more acidic. So they're directly correlated. The air is getting warmer, CO2 is going up, and the oceans are getting less basic, more acidic. And this definitely has this is Houston last year, this has major effect on humans. But major effect on humans and major effects on organisms are two different things. There are effects on organisms, but humans are definitely probably more vulnerable. So if your main emphasis is humans, this is a very serious problem. If your main emphasis isn't humans, it's less, I don't want to say it's less, it's just not quite as pressing. So there are positive effects. I mean, there's a huge greening effect. As you put CO2 in the atmosphere, these are all areas over a 25-year period that got greener. Plants lose water when they do photosynthesis. Water runs out when CO2 goes in. So when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, they don't have to open up these little holes to get these stomata to get carbon dioxide in. So you can look at like a hillside and look at the change over time. So this is from the IPCC, the last one. Thus, with high confidence, the CO2 fertilization effect will lead to enhanced net primary productivity. That's how much green stuff there is. So there are definitely positives. If you're an insect living in here, that's a positive. If you need a wet habitat, if you need a dry habitat, it's a negative. But more organisms need wet habitats. So the last major time this occurred was 56 million years ago. There was a lot of volcanoes, the Earth's orbit changed a little, and over 20,000 years, rapid release of CO2, 30 times what we've released since 1850, also methane. And global temperatures went up about 5 degrees C, which is a fair amount. Sea levels went up 5 meters, like 15, 16 feet. Just to show you how much that is, the Ice Age 20,000 years ago, sea levels were about 300 feet lower, 350 feet lower than they are now, 400 feet lower. So this was a major event. So we can look at this as, what happens if you just ramp up CO2 levels? And things definitely change. Sea levels go up. And it's a little bit of a different situation. It starts with an ice-free world. The Arctic Ocean was a little bit different. Panama and South America are a little bit different. But the main thing that happens is there's a huge burst in productivity. So things evolve. Pigs, deer, camels, whales, primates, us. We're only here because of this event. That's when our group evolves. So there's this huge burst of diversity because it's a warmer, wetter world. There's alligators and palm trees at the South Pole. So this would be bad for humans, there's no doubt. But this Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, this is not the end of nature. This is a boom for nature. So there's short-term effects on nature, but the long-term effects are actually really positive. So this kind of apocalyptic view of climate change, that's what I'm trying to get you guys away from. That it's serious, but definitely from a nature perspective, in the long term, it's a positive. And the other point is about tipping points. It's hard to know about tipping points. This is a study, you can look at this later. But the last thing I want to mention is how it's not a problem we're going to solve in the West. The last slide. So this is a graph of CO2 emissions from 65 to 2019. And it looks at like America in red. So if you look at our emissions from 1965 to now, we peaked around the time you guys were born, but we've been going down since then. Europe's in blue, they also went down since then. The real climb though is right about when you guys were born is when China took off. So at that time, China was less than where we are. If you look at the width of this gold band versus the width of this red band, but then China takes off. So it's now almost twice what we're producing. And then there's India. And then there's a series of other non-Western countries. So the solution to climate change, the low-hanging fruit's been picked in the West. The rest of it's going to happen in the non-West. And that's just really hard to convince people that don't have electricity that they need to cut back their CO2 for the planet. We're relatively comfortable. It's easy for us to cut back a little, but if you don't have refrigeration for your milk, it's going to be really hard to convince somebody that their kid can't drink refrigerated milk. So that's that is. Let me pause sharing. So that's kind of what I had to say. Liz, do you want to do questions or?
Yeah, that'd be great. If anyone has any questions, feel free to speak or put it in the chat. We've got some time for some questions.
I had a question. So for the work that you do, is it mostly like looking at data and other people's research they've done, or do you actually go out into the field in nature and do your own studies?
Yeah, I do my own studies. I mean, I review for the IPCC, but then so my students and I, we look at lakes around here, and we look at little microorganisms that live in the lakes, and we look at how they're changing now that these lakes have gotten more acidic. And then we recreate these ponds also in lab, and then stage encounters with predators. And we found that the Daphnia, these little water fleas, they don't behaviorally, they're not as good at avoiding predation. So they have trouble when they're raised with acidity. So it's having a negative effect on them. Other questions?
I have a quick question. I don't know if it's so much of a question as a comment. I really like that you're focusing on the things that we can accomplish here. It is like a little jarring to hear like climate change, don't concern yourself with it. But I guess I'm just thinking about like with all these devastations happening in human lives, you have things like the picture you showed of the flood, right? You've got cars turned over, you've got electrical wires loose, you've got a lot of pollution that accumulates in those events. And I'm just like not feeling settled in the sense that those events only affect humans and the wildlife, other species are like gonna be okay. Can you comment on that?
So definitely in the short term, other species aren't okay. I mean, climate change has effects on other species. I was more talking about, students often have a view that there's kind of this apocalyptic positive feedback loop. It's the end of nature. And that's what I was trying to argue against. It's definitely a major effect on humans. Long term, and when a biologist talks about long term, they're really talking long term, thousands and millions of years. So, our timescales are a little different. But no, I mean, if there's floods, things get overturned, pollutants get released. It's just that we forget the drip of habitat destruction. I mean, when you go back to your hometown now and you see that field you used to play soccer on isn't there anymore, you don't really notice it day by day. Just on campus, we keep taking more and more habitat. And it's not very dramatic. It isn't a flood, it isn't a hurricane, but it totally adds up. People keep building new houses. And that has serious effects on organisms. It just isn't dramatic. It's not sexy, but it's real. And it's totally preventable. Nobody wants to build a shopping center. They only do it to make money. So you can pay people and they go away. Whereas developing electricity is really hard to convince somebody not to do, not to hook up their village. So one of them is doable, I'm trying to make the argument, and one is really hard to do. You almost have to change the entire world and change all societies. And we've been doing this for 30 years. And we started this in the late 80s. And we've got very little to show for it. I mean, CO2 levels keep going up. Other questions?
So I was wondering about, sorry, or do you want to go?
No, you go ahead. I'll ask.
Okay. So like as a human population of the globe, it seems like we keep going up, and I know it's kind of like the growth rate is going down, but it seems like we're going to continue that trend of growing as a population. So do you think that that's possible to do that while not like taking more habitat and destroying more habitats? Could we keep expanding without doing that?
Right. So, I mean, human population isn't growing as fast, but it's still growing. And that, none of these would be issues without human population. I mean, all of us could have a much bigger footprint if there was fewer of us. The problem with attacking the problem through human population is each of the people on this Zoom call have an idea in their head of what a family is. And that took 20 years to form. And, if you marry somebody and they want to have one extra kid or one fewer kid, you might bargain with that. But if they want to add 3 or take away 3, that's just not up for debate. And so convincing people to have fewer kids is really a hard sell because of that idea of what a family is so deep in your mind. I mean, what does Thanksgiving look like? How many people are around the table? That's in your head. And I can't show you a graph and say, and you'll come out with it saying, oh, okay, I guess I want to have kids. You've convinced me, Dr. Lefcourt. Good for you. So population, again, is a huge problem, but the question is that something you can address? I mean, you can provide, healthcare options, things like that. But once you've done that, education for women is the key thing you can do. That always reduces populations. But once you've done that, it's really hard to move it any further.
I had a question. Why do you think there is such a apocalyptic view about climate change? Why do you think that is? Because you're the first professor that's really told me, no, this isn't what's happening.
I mean, I'm just going with what's in the report. I think people I mean, you can take Judeo-Christian Islam out of a person or the person out of it, but you can't take it out of people. I mean, we're kind of raised in these, Noah flood type way of looking at the world: sin, being warned, sinning again, and being smacked. So we kind of think in an apocalyptic way. We think of positive feedback loops, snowballs that get bigger and bigger as they roll down. We don't think about negative feedback where the problem corrects itself, or there's some damage, but then it turns off. So I think it just kind of appeals to our psyche. People like climate change because it answers every issue. Whereas habitat loss is such a boring little niggling problem where you have, a shopping center here, a housing development there, a farmer field chopping down a forest. They're little things one at a time. And so I think people like climate change because it's just so big and it's so clear with good and evil. But it is a serious problem. I mean, the problem is we've got all these problems. When you say one is less, doesn't mean it's small. Humans are doing so much that I'm just trying to prioritize, but I'm not downplaying it all. Other questions?
Hi, I have a question. So I think it was the last slide that you showed was showing like the distribution of emissions, like comparing countries and over time. So maybe this is less of a question, more like asking you to expand on that a little bit. But it seems to me that as like consumerism continues to rise kind of in the Western world, we're more and more like we're not producing things here in the US, but we're producing them in other countries and then they're coming here. So like in college, I studied, I had a focus on like women in Bangladesh who were employed in fast fashion essentially, and then how it comes back to the US. So it's like technically, the emissions are happening there, but it's actually directly related to like our incessant need to consume things. So I wondered if you could just like comment on that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a major point. This is the problem of calculating whose CO2 it is. So I'm staring at you guys through this new 34-inch screen that I bought a couple of months ago to teach my classes. It was made in China. And so that's under China's CO2 numbers, even though the only reason they made this screen is because I gave them money. So that should be in America's numbers, but it's not. So as we that's the problem with tightening our laws here. If you put in environmental protections or you choke down smokestacks in America, as long as people like me keep handing out cash, other people will make these screens. And so, fashion, is switching from maybe New York or Paris to Bangladesh. And the real cause of CO2 emissions is consumption. And if you can't address consumption, it'll just squirt out to the side. And people will make you stuff if you have money and you give them to them. And all of us are consuming more and more. So yeah, that's what makes it such a hard problem to solve, because it's a global problem, but even when we calculate whose CO2 it is, we usually get it wrong. I mean, the clothes I'm wearing, the clothes you're wearing, the things you're seeing in the background of my Zoom, so many of these weren't made in the United States. And yet, how do we calculate that? That's why I'm trying to make the point that for activism, if you guys want to make a difference, it's one of the hardest things to attack. And if you can get more effect in a different place, local, I mean, that's why think globally, act locally. Climate change is think globally, act globally. And it's just so hard. But habitat loss, you can make real differences. I mean, you guys have power on campus. It's a small little world, but you know, those ducks that graze down by the pond, you know, they've got a quarter of the habitat they did 2 years ago.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for asking questions. If anyone thinks of additional questions they'd like to ask Dr. Lefcort, I'm sure you can reach out or chat message it. I think we're now kind of going to transition to the second part of kind of the format of the forum, which is sort of a reflection and taking action piece to kind of work outside of just educating ourselves on a topic like this. So I'm going to share my screen again with the presentation. Okay, now I'm going to present. Cool. Can everyone still see it okay? Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Lefcort, for presenting on this relevant topic. We appreciate you coming out and taking time out of your day to present. We're going to transition and you're welcome to stay if you'd like, but if you have somewhere else to be, totally understandable as well. Okay. So now I'm going to hand it over to Brady, who is a mission and ministry liaison at the Office of Sustainability. And he's going to guide us through a kind of engaging reflection. So Brady, I will hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Like Delaney said, I'm Brady. First of all, thank you, Dr. Lefcort, for the presentation, very informative. And I work in the Office of Mission and Ministry, and then also for Office of Sustainability is the faith liaison. And I'm just going to kind of guide you today through a sort of reflection journal. So I invite you to grab a piece of paper and a pen. I'm going to do this a little bit differently, where I'll give you guys some time to reflect on these questions, roughly around 10 minutes based on where Liz and Delaney think we are, and then we'll hop into breakout rooms and kind of discuss what we've thought about. And the questions are, and you'll just have these in front of you as you're writing and reflecting, but they are: in the current world you look around at today, how do you most personally feel called to respond to climate change? And then, in reflection of myths debunked regarding the improved health of climate change in a COVID world, how has the pandemic caused you to look differently at climate change and the environment? What compels you the most to act toward improving the environment in your own community? Does the thought of bringing change to the climate overwhelm you, which is known as eco-anxiety? And then, has the pandemic offered you a sense of hope and grace for the future? So, and I invite you to maybe not answer all of these, but maybe pick out a couple that most speak to you in reflection of what Dr. Lefcort was talking about. Maybe one of these is calling to you in a certain way. And so now I invite you to maybe turn off your screen, and we'll take 10 minutes to just kind of reflect on some of these questions and then hop into breakout rooms. So awesome. I think we'll actually plan on 5 minutes for the sake of time, but yeah. Okay, awesome. I think that should be about enough time for everyone, hopefully. Hopefully a little bit of time to engage the thinking. And I hope you guys enjoyed the kind of reflection journal side of reflecting. So I think we're gonna hop into breakout rooms now, Delaney. So cool.
Yeah, I'll be putting people into breakout groups and we'll just.
And so we'll probably just be in breakout rooms for like 5 minutes, come back at the 12:55 because we want to be mindful of everyone's time. And you just introduce yourself to people if you don't know each other, and then maybe share one question that you talked about or wrote about for yourself. And then we'll come back and maybe have 1 or 2 people share what they said if they'd like. So that's what breakout rooms will look like.
Okay, I'll be sending everyone in right now. Everyone should have gotten. An invitation.
Wait,
Oh, Liz is here now.
Hey guys,
what's
Hey.
up?
I think Katie. There's one more girl that's supposed to be here. Oh, here she
Where's Katie? What's
Hey.
up, Katie?
is.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, should we like go around and do some introductions first? I mean, I know not
I think
everybody.
everybody.
Katie's my one of my housemates, Karen, and I think Brady.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wrote for one of the questions I wrote for was the one about like, does the thought of bringing change to the climate overwhelm you? So I thought that was interesting because I think climate change is such a big topic. It's kind of sometimes overwhelming because it impacts so many people and it's just so built in with like the systems that we already have, and to change that is just like it change so much. So I was just writing about how that is very overwhelming. Did you guys also write about that one?
I didn't write about that one, but I definitely can relate. I think the idea of like eco anxiety is like becoming more and more common. And I've heard that like it's a thing that like therapists are starting to address because people are so like on edge about it. So I definitely get that.
I feel like that was for me the question that I reflect on the most, because it's, I mean, the most of the news or most of the social media that you're consuming is like telling you how, I think, negative. I mean, it has a lot of a negative spin on things, and I think that's where most of the eco anxiety would come from. Is you're consuming this news that tells you that, like, I think Dr. Lefcort was trying to push away this idea of like the apocalyptic future, which I think is like sort of reassuring. I wasn't really totally fully understanding of how, but I think I think kind of pushing that away and definitely taking a more optimistic approach to looking at the environment is certainly helpful. I think that it's so easy to be very pessimistic, and I think I think it relieves stress. And you don't want to like take away the gravity from the situation, but I think certainly it's important to be like less worried and more like willing to enact change. It's like that positive, active effort to make a difference. But and I thought that one was kind of interesting. So
I honestly like touched on all of them, but one of them was like what motivates you, and one of mine was just like seeing all of the like severe weather things that have been happening. And just recently there were the big snowstorms that actually killed some people in Texas and probably other states too. But I just thought it was interesting because I know that a major reason why they died was because they didn't have enough electricity in that moment. So it's just interesting because like we obviously want to reduce the electricity, but then I don't know, it's just very contradictory. But obviously if we reduce that normally, we should be using it when we need it the most. But yeah, just those major tragic events I think really puts it into like more of a visual thing in my mind, because I often when like speakers like him are talking, I don't really understand what's going on. But I think when you actually see something big happen, you're like, okay, like this is a big problem. So
Yeah, I know that makes sense for sure. I think what's interesting about what happened in Texas is just like how, yeah, we should use less electricity, but if our grid was more efficient in the electricity that we have, it would have been way better. Like, I don't know, it's tricky. But yeah, Hugh's talking a lot about like really big ideas. I think he's like trying to narrow it down for us, but sometimes it's hard to like, when it's only like a 20-minute presentation, to fully understand what he's saying. Okay, I'm closing the rooms now. Karen, do you want to share anything? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll just comment, I guess, on the last prompt, which I think was the one about like, do you feel hopeful or like not? To be honest, I think I don't, which is not great. But I think just with this past year, we saw like the emissions going down, but it's still, we're already returning to like pre-COVID levels. So it's just kind of like, it's like we saw the good thing and we still can't maintain it. It's like, I don't know. It's like money always wins out in a capitalist society. So I think that's just like really frustrating to try to grasp.
Yeah, it's really our systematic issues is why we can't really.
Right.
So. Okay, bye guys.
Bye.
Okay, I think everyone's back from breakout groups. Should we move on to the next slide?
Cool. Okay. Well, I guess for the sake of time, we'll kind of just keep going along with the presentation. Thank you guys for participating in the breakout rooms. I hope it was helpful to kind of talk with other people about some of the reflection questions that Brady led on. And so now that we're kind of wrapping up the event, these are just some office events and opportunities to kind of stay involved with the work that the Office of Sustainability is doing. One of them is you can join the office's newsletter In Balance. It comes out roughly every month. And if you want to be put on that list, you can just put your emails in the chat and Liz and I will put you on the list. And then also we have a couple social media pages you're welcome to follow on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. It's just SAGScope Green. And then one of our workshops that Liz and I did last semester around Thanksgiving was a sourdough starter workshop, kind of going off of, the big quarantine trend of making bread. We decided to do a video on it and it was really fun and we're kind of goofy on it. So if you're interested in learning how to start your own starter and make your own bread, that's an opportunity. And this will be in a follow-up email along with a post-event survey, because we love to get feedback from people, especially with Zoom meetings. We try to make it as engaging as possible, but we're always open to feedback as well. So with that, thank you all for coming. If you have any questions or comments, Liz and I will probably stick around for a couple minutes before our next class. But wanted to say thank you for coming to an event and we hope to see you at another one.
Thank you guys. It's great having you.
Thank you for coming.
This was great. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming.
thank you guys.
Thank you.